You are listening to a Sustainable World Radio podcast. Sustainable World Radio brings you in-depth interviews, news, and commentary about positive solutions to environmental challenges. Solutions that adhere to the permaculture ethics of earth care, people care, fair share. Are you interested in learning more about permaculture projects around the globe? How to plant a food forest? Restorative design or ethnobotany? Then stay tuned for Sustainable World Radio. I'm your host and producer, Jill Cloutier. In this short episode, I speak with Vandana Shiva, environmental activist, author, and scholar. I met with Vandana for 15 minutes to talk about pulses and how these plants can increase soil health and help us farm non-violently. Pulses are the edible seeds of plants in the legume family. Some pulses you may be familiar with are chickpeas, lentils, beans, and dry peas. If you'd like to learn more about Vandana Shiva's work, visit vandanashiva.com or navdanya.org. Welcome to the program, Vandana Shiva. Thank you for being here today.
My pleasure.
For those who may not know, what type of plants are pulses?
Well, pulses are the forgotten richness, both richness for the soil's health as well as our health. And the reason they've been forgotten is because the nitrogen fixing that they do non-violently in their root system was displaced with the nitrogen fertilizers that came from fossil fuels. And the vitality of growing pulses with your cereals in order to produce nitrogen was considered dispensable. But the second reason why pulses were forgotten is they are really rich protein foods. And with the domination of the factory farming industry and the meat industry, they made people believe that proteins can only come from meat. So between the assault of the fossil fuel industry and synthetic fertilizers and the assault of the meat industry, the amazing work pulses do for us has been forgotten. And I'm so glad the United Nations declared 2016 the year of pulses so that we can remember we don't need synthetic fertilizers that are creating dead zones, giving us nitrogen oxides that are 300 times more deadly in terms of damaging the climate than carbon dioxide. And we don't really need to put so many animals in factory farms that a large part of our diet should be plant proteins.
Mm-hmm. And pulses contribute also, I think as far as they're impressive nitrogen fixers, and they contribute to soil health too, and climate resilience as well.
Well, there are three ways in which pulses contribute to sustainability. First, by fixing nitrogen, they actually enrich the soil because they're not just fixing nitrogen, they're also giving organic matter through their leaves, through their leaf fall. When you apply synthetic fertilizers, you're destroying the soil health. Pulses improve soil health. Secondly, because pulses are part of the carbon cycle and the nitrogen cycle, they actually fix two broken cycles that industrial farming has broken. Industrial farming has forced a shooting beyond the planetary boundary of nitrogen and carbon. And both of these overloads on the ecosystem and the planet can be totally avoided when we let the pulses work with us to close the cycle of carbon and nitrogen.
And do pulses, I think India is the number one grower of pulses, and do pulses also help farmers who are growing these plants economically?
Pulses help farmers because farmers then don't have to buy urea, which then requires more water. And in today's context of increasing drought everywhere, with pulses in your farming system, you can actually survive a drought because they're also drought tolerant. India was the largest producer and eater of pulses. Sadly, globalization and the distortions of free trade have made India an importer. And before that, the Green Revolution, based on monocultures of rice and wheat, got rid of pulses. And instead of letting pulses do the nitrogen fixing, we started to become dependent on urea. Now, India is being made artificially dependent on imports. And there's a horrible yellow pea that is being grown in Canada, which is being dumped on India. It's 7% protein when our pulses give us 25 to 35% protein. It is tasteless, so people aren't buying it. And yet the government is importing it because that's how corruption works. I'm on the board of advisors of our Auditor General. I'm on the Auditor's Advisory Board. And our auditor's office has done a whole report on how every year we're losing 1,200 crores, which is like 12 billion rupees in terms of corruption linked to these imports, besides the billions that are going into buying what we should be growing. We're losing every year 1.1 billion kilograms of soil nitrogen, which our pulses could produce, and 1 million tons of protein that our people could have because we are importing inferior pulses. So this idea of industrial agriculture plus free trade and globalization is a lethal idea, which is destroying our planet as well as our diets. And what we need is more ecological agriculture, more permanent agriculture, and more localized food systems based on food sovereignty.
How did the Green Revolution, with its emphasis on monocropping and chemical agriculture, affect traditional pulse production in India? You've kind of answered that. And worldwide, how did we get into this predicament?
Yeah. So after the war, industry that was making explosives and ammunition by fixing atmospheric nitrogen had also developed the capacity to make synthetic fertilizers. And after the war, they started to push these fertilizers. Now, to push these fertilizers, they used the drought of 1965 to say, use the US government, World Bank, and all the powers that be, that we will not give you additional wheat in a year of drought if you don't change your agriculture. But the most important point about the Green Revolution was plants were redesigned in order to adapt to chemicals, because the native varieties cooperate with each other. So a wheat plant will cooperate with the pulse plant. But when you have to apply lots of fertilizers, first of all, your wheat plants have to be made dwarf varieties, and your pulse has to be driven out of the field because you can't apply the same amount of urea for the two plants. They start to compete rather than cooperate. So very cooperative arrangements become competitive arrangements, and monocultures become necessary for any external input system, which is why all systems of agriculture that are permanent and our internal input systems are always diverse, where different species play different roles and help each other. So we now have monocultures of rice and wheat and huge amounts of nitrogen fertilizer. But the more fertilizer you use, the more water you have to use. So we now have a water crisis of a very, very severe kind. Then when plants get that much water, and under the Green Revolution with chemical fertilizers, for the same amount of food production, you use 10 times the water. And plants using that much water are more vulnerable to pests because they have more sap in it. Therefore, you need more pesticides, and the entire treadmill of poisons keeps expanding. So you've lost your water, you've lost your soil fertility, you've made your fields more vulnerable to pests and diseases, which is wonderful for the chemical industry. But for the farmer, he gets into deeper and deeper debt. And for the ecosystem, it gets more impoverished.
And that was I was going to ask is who benefits from this change in agriculture from traditional agriculture to this chemical? And I know the answer, but I'd like to hear it from you.
The continuity of traditional agriculture, and traditional agriculture does not mean it's static. This illusion that if it's traditional, it means it's stuck is such a wrong illusion, because There has been constant changes in traditional agriculture. Otherwise, how could traditional agriculture have fed 5, 6, 7 times the population if it hadn't been evolving all the time? The disruption happens because of war industry, the chemical industry, and today there are 5 companies controlling the seed and the chemical inputs. They're the ones who gain as nature loses and people lose.
But they ultimately won't gain because they're on the planet. We're all citizens of the earth.
The reason they think they're gaining is because the idea of a corporation is separate from the idea of people. It's a construct. And therefore, this construct becomes more dominant in the minds of those who work in it and serve it. And therefore, they assume that the bottom line for the corporation is a higher value than protecting the earth and the future, their own future also.
One thing, too, that I thought was interesting is that in India, it seems like a lot of GMO crops, and worldwide, in the United States also, many, many GMO crops. And I think BT cotton is a big thing there.
Yeah.
Are there alternatives to BT cotton in India?
No, there's only BT cotton. And BT cotton is in very big trouble this year because finally the government is acting on all the fronts of fraud that Monsanto engaged in. The fraud of collecting royalties and pushing our farmers to suicide, the fraud of taking patents, the fraud of creating monopoly, all of this works against our constitution and our laws. And finally, the government has started to take legal steps.
And what prompted them to do so?
The crisis that BT was not controlling pests, and beyond a point, no government that can sit around and watch crops fail. The fact that our farmers were getting into debt and they were committing suicide. And again, they've already delayed it by 2 decades, but now finally they're realizing there's a deeper agrarian crisis.
You say that we must farm non-violently and advocate making peace with the earth. How can we do that? What are some first steps people can take to do that?
I think growing pulses is a very, very important first step in nonviolent farming, because the alternative to pulses, fixing nitrogen nonviolently through the rhizobium in the root system, is the violent blasting of fossil fuels at 500 degrees to fix atmospheric nitrogen. But the violence doesn't stop there. It began earlier by the fracking for the gas, the fossil fuel extraction, and it carries on after, because the soil organisms die with the application of synthetic nitrogen. The runoff is creating the dead zones, and our oceans are dying, and our atmosphere is losing its ability to regulate the climate because the nitrogen oxide is destabilizing our climate. So the violence is very, very big in a fossil agriculture. But the alternative of nonviolent farming is farming with the earth, with the ecological laws of replenishment of water, nitrogen, carbon. And making peace with the earth is to really recognize first that the earth is the first source of all abundance, her soil fertility, her biodiversity, her water. And our role is to protect those systems and be co-creators with the earth. Making peace with the earth, for me, means recognizing our creative abilities and not being proud of our destructive capacity.
And you became an activist many decades ago. And what sparked that awakening for you?
Well, I became an activist more than 4 decades ago with the Chipko movement, which is the Hug the Tree movement of the Himalaya. And what sparked my joining this movement as a volunteer was seeing my favorite streams and forests disappear. I had grown up as a child imagining that a forest would be there forever, a river would flow forever. And when I saw them disappear, I realized that there were forces of destruction who could make money by destroying nature, and therefore I had to give my life in the defense of nature.
Vandana, we're getting to the end of our time together. Can you share with our listeners why you feel protecting biodiversity and the integrity of the seed is so important? That's really driving you.
For me, biodiversity and seed have become the center of my commitment to protection of the earth, because on the one side, it's the takeover of seed, its genetic modification, its patenting, that is at the heart of the control of the food system. It is the heart of the destruction of our diversity and our sustainability, pushing our farmers into debt and suicide, but giving us bad food, toxic food, taking away our choices. Look at the fact that the United States citizen has to struggle so hard for a simple fact of labeling, when 64 countries have mandatory labeling of GMOs. But on the other side, on the creative and constructive side, seed and biodiversity are the alternative to the world of poisons and pesticides. They are the alternative to the world of GMOs and patenting. So it is but natural to dedicate my energy to this.
So you take on some of the largest and most powerful corporations in the world, and I'm wondering if you ever get scared and if you're tempted not to speak out so strongly, ever.
I have never got scared. I was trained to be fearless, both in my family context, my parents, as well as my culture. That's what Gandhi left us with, fearlessness. I have had threats. I've had huge attacks by these corporations. And the more they attack me, the more I realize that the small steps I'm taking are making a difference. And therefore, I must continue to take those small steps. It increases my resolve.
And is there anything else you want to tell people around the world?
Well, save your seeds and know your food.
Thank you. Thank you so much. You've been listening to a Sustainable World Radio podcast. You can find us online at sustainableworldradio.com and also on iTunes. For more information about permaculture and ecology, visit the Sustainable World Media YouTube channel, where you'll find videos about permaculture, aquaponics, organic gardening, rainwater harvesting, and much, much more. Sustainable World Radio is a listener-supported program. If you like what we do, please consider making a donation to the show. I'm your host and producer, Jill Cloutier, and thank you so much for listening.